tonight, I am so happy to introduce an artist who I have watched for decades. I have always loved the way Ian Pedigo thinks, the way he makes. He is one of those people who seems to have been destined, to my mind, to be an artist, and art is better for it. Based in New York, Ian grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, and in some ways he seems the product of his geography. As a conceptual and sculptural installation artist, he has a keen eye that is always roaming, and he gives himself room to think. It may be a stretch, but it seems that his interests, demeanor, and practice are in part the result of the spaces and nature that he grew up with, perhaps in relation to where he landed. Ian also cites anthropology, architecture, and the esoteric as interests that have informed his work. With a BFA from the University of Dallas in Irving and an MFA from the University of Texas, Austin, Ian has Texas ties. He has shown internationally at galleries and venues in the UK, Belgium, Germany, Sweden, Italy, France, and Canada, as well as several cities across the U.S. His work has been written about in multiple publications, including Artforum, Art in America, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and Art News. With work in the collection of the Whitney Museum of Art, Ian has been recognized for his art via grants and awards, including the Pollock-Krasner Award, and in 2011, a monograph on his work was published by the Southern Alberta Art Gallery. Within his practice, Ian explains that his consideration of the artifact spans a few decades, while his notion of the modal environs provides a fresh take on art making in the post-digital age as one dealing with an ecology of aesthetics brought forward through an ever-escalating medium of immaterial poetics. You see why I like the way he thinks? If you would, please join me in welcoming Ian Pedigo as he talks about future artifacts.
Well, thank you everybody for coming here tonight for the Tuesday night talks. It's a real honor for me to be here. As Terry said, I studied here in Texas at the University of Dallas, graduating in 1999, and I got my MFA in Austin, graduating 2002. Some 20 years ago, more or less, I was here for my first Tuesday night talk. I can remember on the stage with Richard Tuttle that night, so it's kind of nice to be imagining myself even coming close to filling such shoes, but it's a pleasure to be here, really. So I want to start with the words of a writer, critic, and Rosicrucian named Josephine Péladan. Péladan is considered by some to have been the first modern curator. He organized a series of exhibitions in the late 1800s known as the Salons de la Rose-Croix that were recently the subject of an exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in New York a couple of years ago entitled Mystical Symbolism, the Salon de la Rose-Croix in Paris, 1892 to 1897. He says, "Artist, you are a priest. Art is the great mystery, and if your effort results in a masterpiece, a ray of divinity will descend as on an altar. Artist, you are a king or queen. Art is the true empire. If your hand draws a perfect line, the cherubim themselves will descend to revel in their own reflection. They may one day close the church, but what about the museum? If Notre Dame is profaned, the Louvre will officiate. Humanity, O citizens, will always go to Mass when the priest will be Bach, Beethoven, or Palestrina." And elsewhere, he goes on to say, "Art is the totality of the methods of realizing beauty. Beauty is the essence of all expression through form. Techniques are nothing more than the means to an end. If beauty is objective and art the means, what is the rule? The ideal. Classically speaking, we may lay out ideal forms and beauty ontologically in the following way. This outline highlights the cosmology of being following a general model taken from the Platonic school of thought. At the top, we have the ineffable one, the form of the good. This was considered to be the origin of all things, the one thing which all derived from and that which all desired to return to. The next level down, we find the intelligible or intellective world. Yeah, and I don't expect to, everyone to remember this, but I just want to give a basic idea of what, frames the idea of art as I'm approaching it. So the next level down from the one, the realm of ideal forms, the realm where intelligence become realized. And in the past, this was even where they considered angelic beings to exist. And here, directly under the one, is the form of beauty. Next down, the level of soul, the sensible world, where thinking and emotions were also considered to take place. Its conceptual forms applied here, if connected to higher, ideal forms, were thought to orient the soul upward, uplifting it, assisting in its intellective and rational nature. Yet, if they were connected to lesser forms connected solely to materialism or the appetite, this was considered to orient the soul downward, or in worst cases, it was considered to be the cause of illness. And finally, at the bottom, we have body in the material world, and under that, the underworld, which was considered to be the realm of chaos, death, forgetting, and oblivion. So, why open a talk about making art in the post-digital art contemporary world with a classical view of art, ontology, and mystery? Well, the first reason for me is to suggest that the rudimentary nature of art itself is immaterial, a force with form that can affect our intellectual, emotional, sensorial, and physical natures. Although connected to physical media, art is something other than material, technique, process, or skill that goes into making it. The second reason is to talk about how art is something other than common reality. Even though art is connected to the common, the mundane, or the material world, it is something which disrupts or breaks us out of our mundane or everyday experience, something that commands us to stop, look, listen, to feel. In art, there's something else which connects us to a larger aspect of life that is enduring, yet evasive. Over the past number of centuries, the question of what can art be has often been asked in the Western world. And throughout history, we've seen answers spanning movements, styles, and processes, covering the most common and physical to the most conceptual and immaterial. We've become familiar with the questions of what can art be, and have adapted and accepted that art can exist in any medium or arrive in many different forms. While focused on its material affect, though, we often seem to ignore the question of what can art do. For me, art has always been about its mystery. Not just an aesthetic, formal, or process-based mystery, but a mystery of its origins in nature, how it interacts with the human imagination and emotions, and how it becomes expressed in our sensory world through symbolic or gestural communication. In this arena, art becomes something with the potential to speak a language that could be apprehended without forethought or prediction, and yet, connected to its intrinsic nature, it speaks fluently, yet unspeakably, silently, to be turned outward and expressed in the external world. This unspeakable aspect, like a mystery language of its own, is what first drove me to art. And so I agree with the classical idea that beauty is the ideal form to which humans aspire. However, the question becomes, how do we define what beauty is? What one considers to be beautiful, another might find repulsive. In its basic definition, however, if beauty is the quality or aggregate of qualities in a person or a thing that gives pleasure to the senses or exalts the mind or spirit, then with this definition, the actualized physical or conceptual form of beauty is still left wide open. And so for me, I begin showing images of photos that I take when I'm out and about. And for me, I find beauty in several places, in the natural world, in the material world, superimposed over the human-built world, in worlds of ideas or forms. I see beauty through environments with an atmosphere that convey a certain mood. I'm losing my notes here, sorry. Bear with me for a second. No, sorry, they're not appearing here. It's not the cursor, I'm switching slides, but the text is staying the same. Okay, I might just have to wing it. In architectural fragments that speak a narrative, in the relationship between gestural forms, such as in this chair and in this sculpture, beauty in random things that kids do, for example, that seem to them like a good idea. In things you discover hidden at night, through unified, sort of unintended aesthetic languages that happen, through colorful object gestures, through objects appearing like images, and other objects appearing like images, through scenes that I encounter that seem to present themselves as still lives, or even in forms such as this where you have the natural commercial signage and graffiti all sharing the same space. Okay. Yeah, I'm okay. It's appearing now. Sorry. Okay. I will begin with examples of my own work, which is marking a particular moment several years after I arrived in New York. This was a time after my first son was born, and when my work at that time took a dramatic turn. As someone who arrived to New York via Texas, born in Alaska, I had already felt like an observer there, and yet my role as an artist seemed to be becoming more like an anthropologist or an archaeologist. So what was I investigating? I was turning to the fray of the city, the portions where it was fragmenting, unmaintained, and falling apart. The urban decay, debris in the streets, and detritus. I was looking at what I saw as artifacts from the urban environment, and I brought these into my studio and began collaborating with them, changing them, allowing them to speak in their own, producing new forms that came out of this process. I added my own elements, products that showed evidence of my own hand in relation to these natural, ready-made forms, placing them on the same strata as an equivalent gesture of artist and nature. With these elements, I began forming my own formal language. this relationship between the artifact and the human hand began to occupy a space, a style, and a manner of making all their own. And in 2007, I participated in a few shows and began considering the works not only as individual pieces, but as a cluster, as a grouping of things spun off from one another, creating their own microgalaxy. And the printed image, as we've seen in a few places already, makes an introduction early in these works. The magazine pages I was using, chose them for their color, for the images they depicted when turned upside down or sideways, or how I could just arrange them into a pattern. I relied sometimes on quasi-architectural forms to guide my building of objects. At the same time, they were becoming more graphic, being reduced to a thin space, barely delineating between what might be considered to be an object and that which would be considered to be an image. I started using other things I found outside as well. In New York, there are a lot of film crews out in the street sometimes, and they leave debris behind. And once I found a piece of this lighting gel filter, which you see in the center of this work. And this material for me, speaking of the thinness of an object that is barely between object and image, was something I was really attracted to, and why I decided to put this into my work. And it's actually something I ended up using quite often afterwards. Oops. Losing. I was using remnants found in advertisements, combined with my own drawing, magazine pages, and dimensional wood. I was working with them all as ready-made objects in their own right, leveled to the same plane and made equal by the surface. So, up to this point, the idea of how I've been working with artifacts that I collected outside seems pretty clear. Struggling again with the cursor. It's okay. So up to this point, the idea of how I've been working with artifacts that I collected outside is pretty clear. I should say, though, that the idea of the artifact for me had become something other than the discovered human cultural object. By virtue of collaborating with the object's intrinsic nature and how the object revealed a trace of its own unraveling left over after the fact of its making, these elements combined to reveal to me that new artifacts were being produced through the act of making. The final object itself, in other words, was an artifact that bared the record of its own making in physical form. And here we have a few definitions of how to approach the idea of an artifact. The first we have is an object made by a human being, typically an item of cultural or historical interest. And this idea is apparent in my work through the way I've been recovering objects from outside. The second is as an unintended anomaly or phenomenon indicating a flaw or technical failure through a process, system, or code. This idea is apparent through the way I had begun to consider objects as images, and how the disrupted object was in fact revealing new artifacts. The third, an observable result through investigation or experiment that is not naturally present but occurs as a result of the preparative or investigative procedure. This was becoming apparent considering the way I'd begun working my own hand into the nature of the work. The investigative process of working with these materials affected the material outcome, resulting in a new object comprised of various artifacts. So these considerations of the found artifact, the artist's hand, and the resultant object led me further to consider about the relationship between what was internal and what was external. And for me, the external was to be found at first in the found artifact, while the internal involved its individual processing. The form then becomes externalized again with the final result, with even further external and internal considerations made through the resultant object and in the objects in the space surrounding it. So it might seem obvious at this point to consider that the installation or the environment of the show became a consideration of its own for me. So in this show, which was in Paris in 2009, this was perhaps the first show I really began to work with this idea as the installation as an object itself. Some of the works at this point were involving, like I said, involving collaborations with the ready-made artifacts, and others involved forms I came up with entirely on my own. So I wasn't making any distinction between what I was creating in my own imagination versus the objects I was putting together from things I found outside. The concept of space and how the works interacted with each other to create aesthetic image within that space is what began playing a primary role. And because of this individual object versus group spatial relationship, I began thinking the works were like wearing multiple hats. So on one hand, they contained their own internal concerns, where on the other hand, they played a part in creating a bigger picture within the context of the exhibition. And the resultant aesthetic image of that show then, which in its entirety was the environment containing the group of objects, images, and individual concerns, as I said, is something I started to see as the object itself. I continued to work in this manner, including the show, it was in London in 2009. And during this time, I discovered that an aesthetic image, which I'm calling the whole image of the show, which was diverse and comprised of different qualities, was preferable to one which showed uniform objects. In other words, the way that I'm working is very heterogeneous. It's not a matter of taking a process and applying it in a serial method, one piece to the other. I was actually making things in opposition to other works. So I would make something in one piece and respond to it, react to it, you'd say oppositely in another way. And space, such as this example, becomes a concern also with objects spanning the floor, addressing the viewer's perspective. So when the viewer walks into the space, initially, they see, the backside of this work. And when they turn around the corner, they see this other side with the stones coming out. So in this piece, the lighting gel filters, this is the first work actually where I decided working solely with the lighting gel filters. And these are segments that are just as how they are when you buy them. They come in these sheets that are about, like 16 by 20 inches or something. And this form is possibly the thinnest form available, I determined, to delineate between the object and the image, with the form of the object being reduced to a transparent film that conveys light. In this show in Canada in 2009, I worked with these ideas about space, the internal nature and external nature quite literally, as this show consisted of materials and objects I picked up outside the gallery, as well as others that I brought with me. So, for example, the stones in this piece I collected in the gully nearby the museum. It was in Alberta. There are a lot of ravines and sort of landscape carved by glaciers during the last ice age. And the carpet actually from this was a remnant of carpet that was left over from another part of the museum as it was being renovated. So you can see at this point, it doesn't really matter to me exactly where the materials come from. I mean, in the sense of, do they have the same taxonomy? Are they natural or are they synthetic? I'm really at this point interested in putting everything together as long as they speak an aesthetic language with each other and they become sort of flattened, which is to say the separations between them become collapsed in a way. And I was interested in a collapse of separation between the natural and human-made worlds, just as I had been interested in the found object being on the same plane as the making of the object as a whole. I should also say that these works also attempted to disrupt the classical idea of sculpture in the round, where instead of approaching the idea that space was something you tour around the object to view it, but more so that space is a perceptual construct, and the artifactual object representing the record of an experience formed in that space. So the idea for sculpture being classically in the round, we might assume that this distinction was made to make a distinction between the three-dimensional object and the two-dimensional object. But what we know about experiencing art today, perhaps more than any other period of time, is that the object, loosely defined, is not just the physical object per se, but the perceptual vehicle of the object that defines that object as it moves around. This vehicle is something we might simply call the image, a portable representation of the object we take around with us. An ever-increasing reliance on images to communicate and to socialize has led to an increase of the active space surrounding the object, to the extent that the space in question is no longer just a space within the room, but it is an expanded space involving an engagement with personally developed and socially influenced considerations and experiences. It is through this expanded sense of space that I consider the work becoming involved in the creation of what I'm calling an aesthetic image. An image involving a wider set of considerations than what is depicted in a photograph. It involves an entire world that object participates in identifying and maintaining. In Susan Sontag's essay from 1977 on photography, she says the following in relation to the photographic image. She says, "Photographs are perhaps the most mysterious of all the objects that make up and thicken the environment we recognize as modern. Photographs really are experience captured, and the camera is the ideal arm of consciousness in its acquisitive mood. As photographs give people an imaginary possession of a past that is unreal, they also help people to take possession of space. Photography has become one of the principal devices for experiencing something, for giving an appearance of participation. If we reflect on how pervasively photography has entered into our daily experience and also consider how it has influenced the way we look and relate to things, we might, through being able to take possession of a space, as Sontag describes, apply the same idea to the aesthetic image involving physical objects standing right in front of us. For Sontag, the photograph is essentially the documentation, or an artifact, in other words, of experience. Very much in the same way I have so far described my works as artifacts, as objects that address their physical space that are then made into aesthetic images. So since we are speaking of images which can be retained and called back to memory, extending into memories and an inhabitation of space, as well as objects which are defined as artifacts through addressing their own nature, with the inclusion and expanded sense of space surrounding that object, a space that includes personally developed and socially informed experiences at this point, I suggest we're dealing with deeper implications as to what is interior and what is exterior in relation to the image or even the object. So in 1980, Roland Barthes, in his work Camera Lucida, he spoke of two aspects that determine how an image operates and is interpreted, and he referred to these as the punctum and the studium. For him, the studium denotes the cultural, linguistic, and political interpretation of an image, while the punctum denotes the wounding or the personally touching detail establishing a direct relationship with the object or person within the image. In other words, the studium for Barthes relates to the world of learning as it develops through social cognition. The punctum, on the other hand, is the experiential or existential factor formed internally within the psyche of the individual. So bringing these two ideas together of the punctum and the studium through the internal and external parts of the work, I begin to recognize how experience through the art object is formed halfway as an inner world and halfway as an external world. This had become the broadened definition of sculpture and the object I adapted to, one now dealing also with the broadened definition of the artifact, it now seen as an object existing on the same level as nature and after its transformation as a new object. So something of an interior and exterior concept becomes formally expressed in some of these works also. Such as this piece, there are layers of plexiglass that were covered in dry clay on one side with lighting gel in the filter, lighting gel filter on the other side. And there was an interior space, showing another level of detail. I continue working with objects taken from the outside and brought back in to the studio to be recontextualized. Here, an awareness of the aesthetic image of the work is addressed by what the object is mounted on, creating the impression that the work is now meant to be viewed as a presentable artifact. So this work was used from a found couch spring that I found and mounted it onto this board. And there are some faint traces of drawing up at the top as well. In 2011, in London, I was attempting to approach these works as they relate to different forms of space as we encounter them. So we have wall objects, things that occupy the floor, and in this case, it was one of the first works I made with a volume that was made of fabric. And image-based works such as this appeared around the time, showing how my idea of working with an image became more physical, somewhat like an exploded diagram, revealing several ghosted layers of the same image. And these images served another purpose for me, however, almost like windows that bring in distant outside places into the context of the show's space. In another show in Sweden, 2011, I did something similar as what I did in Canada for that show in 2009. In this show, I made the works also out of several things that I found outside. These made out of fabric, branches, metal chrome, plated pieces. The piece on the wall was made of rubbed eyeshadow and a piece of draped wool. The gallery had been generous enough to allow me to hack away a section of the wall and to present it in the other gallery space adjacent to it. So for me, this is kind of marking how the internal space actually provided the physical matter of the artifact itself. And other works attempted to create an image or scene by bringing this idea of several place settings together. So this image of the island with its offset registration showed an image of a reed someplace, an island with reeds growing on it. And the branches behind it are from what I collected outside. The wall from this piece actually was a section that I had recovered from a temporary wall from the gallery's previous show. So there is a recent branch of philosophy known as object-oriented ontology, or OOO, that investigates objects and their relations. This is something I became aware of later. It wasn't actually something that drove the impetus of my work, but it was kind of a revelation because it seemed to really describe precisely many of the things I was doing or the motivations I had in my work. So in this branch of thinking, the object of object-oriented ontology is an object that can be defined variously as a mailbox, as electromagnetic radiation, as curved space-time, the Commonwealth of Nations, or propositional attitude. This is according to Graham Harman, who is considered to be one of the developers of this idea. And so all things, whether physical or fictional, are equally objects. Instead of a world understood through only the human being at the center, OOO instead involves a recognition of a state of existence wherein causal relations between things can occur without one thing being fully penetrated by the other. So in other words, all things defined as objects exist simultaneously on equal footing in the universe. As Harman states, if the human perception of a house or a tree is forever haunted by some hidden surplus in the things that never becomes present, the same is true of the sheer causal interaction between rocks or raindrops. As if objects, materials, have some state of awareness in and of themselves. With such a development of thought, the result is a view wherein the human object gap holds no privileged status, but is one among many gaps populating a pluriverse, as is described by Levi Bryant, who states that ontology and object-oriented philosophy establish what might be called a heteroverse or a pluriverse, where entities at all levels of scale, whether natural or cultural, physical or artificial, material or semiotic, are on equal ontological footing. Now, some have rebutted the idea of object-oriented ontology, claiming that it degrades meaning by placing the agencies of humans and objects on equal footing. But as you've seen, this leveling of the object with the human dimension is something I've been addressing over and over in my work. This idea of equal footing, however, despite any claim of stripping away any meaning from me, actually holds a great sense of beauty in exactly the same way as I introduced at the beginning. So turning back, we might approach things from a somewhat different perspective. We have seen so far the found artifact becoming interpreted into other objects. In this show from 2013 called Eyes Fixed on Pictures, you could see through the title my influence from the theory behind photography a lot. I used objects such as rubber balls, cow bones, shoelaces, broken pottery, and one piece even included this hat rack. So there's also an understanding of the object being something defined by space, yet something which also defines space. And this piece was another fabric-based piece hung from the ceiling of the gallery, using branches hanging off its side. This is one of the early constellation pieces I did, made out of bone and shoelaces, and it is mounted over several sheets of black foil, and this is a material used in the set lighting industry to block light from reflecting from objects. And the lighting gel piece I mounted to the windows, and the form on the front is created through a resin-saturated type of plaster. So you could see this work really from either side, from the inside or the outside of the gallery, and change during night and day. So considering the idea of a haunted sense of causality, as Harman was saying, existing between objects that exist independently of each other, this work, for example, is made of multiple transparent images layered one over the other. And they're mounted on found shipping pallets. So this, for me, brings together the ideas of these entities existing on the same footing, the object of the image and this sort of ambient aesthetic object produced by these different layers butting against each other. In this show that I did in New York in 2015, I became more involved with this idea of producing aesthetic images by including further narratives and mythologies in my work. So the work was beginning to form its own internal language and was becoming to appear more and more, like one writer said, these looked like artifacts in a natural history museum from some alternate universe. This work used the back of a chair with animal bones and pigeon feathers. And this work was a printed image that I had mounted inside of an old book and put inside of a vitrine. And so, if based on the understanding that objects have their own interior nature, or an identity that exists in parallel with our own inner interpretation, then the result is an artwork reflecting an aesthetic image that comprises each of these experiences on equal footing. In 2014, there's a show from Washington, D.C. I presented a group of works inside of a group show that was its own contained installation. And these works, I continue to work with found and natural objects combined with synthetic and other made objects. Some continue the attempt of leveling the gap between imagination, the human hand, and the independent object. Here is another multi-layered image mounted on a found shipping pallet. And some works, such as this, begin to appear almost figurative, relating to how the body might become another object within this pluriverse as well. maintaining its autonomy while coexisting with all other forms of objects. And you can see the plinth I start using during this time, such as in this work from a show I did in Chicago in 2015. I decided on using the plinth to further address this idea of autonomy for the work as an object creating an image in its own right. So the plinth for me was like a frame, such as you would put around an image or a painting. And so wherever this work travels around, if it does, it contains this frame with it, rather than being defined solely by the space surrounding it when it's shown. And this work was mounted in the window front of a gallery using vertical blinds. So again, playing with this idea of interiority and exteriority. One side visible outside the gallery and the other side visible while inside. And I started producing some smaller scale image-based works. These were like envelopes or sleeves, almost like record sleeves. And they're kind of having a mysterious relationship with the world of commercial products. So in this last section, I just want to introduce the terminology of where I'm working at the present. So over several years of making and thinking and considering art objects, I developed an idea for the type of art that I'm making, and I called this the Modal Environs. And I've defined this as a way of communicating an image or object based on expressions of content or the creation of context which need not be actual, but formulated through a type of pluralistic, aesthetic, spatial memory, itself based on retained and imagined modes of aesthetic representation through existing artifacts, experiences, or images. These aesthetics transfer into an atmosphere, mood, or quality that become a tangible material to create a place or setting through sensory information that extends well beyond the limits of the object's physicality. The ecology of the work, involving an expanded interior and exterior, becomes an environment for producing an image of greater lasting potential, an image born within the language of physical space and visible reality, yet which appeals to the qualities of the imagination. It is an image which varies from the static appearance of everyday reality, however, in that it maintains an experiential operation manifesting as the tactile performance of a perceptual construct, designed as becoming veiled over what we consider as conventional reality. Yet, because of its focus on producing ideal forms, offers a greater experience of being moved by its mystery. It is an image which is meant to somewhat replicate, yet subvert, components of the commonplace into an atmospheric, albeit more changeless, semblance of reality. So, the idea of the modal environs for me places the agency of art back into its place as something that pulls us out of the everyday and attempts to restore a sense of mystery to work, vis-a-vis the common or the mundane object itself. These three pieces were made from various table legs and chair components with plaster bases and draped with shoelaces over the top. So for me, they also represented a kind of totemic and figurative form. This work is made from eyeglass pieces, from an oyster shell, and painted metal. And you could see my work sort of transforming at this time. It's becoming, the color palette is really starting to become more pronounced and kind of hyper electric in a way, I would say. But my understanding of this development, I would say the work is operating at the center between this idea of the internal and external, between its artifactual nature and its image-based objecthood, still existing as an object that presents a hypothetical reality, albeit still real. The implied figure and form of the body here is represented by this magenta form over there. Is actually a shirt collar, and the other piece here is a tree limb that's been sealed off and painted over. So here it's as if the natural world, the figure, or the implied figure, and then this base that it's installed on is sort of like a model form of architecture. It becomes almost like representative of a social structure. This piece, using deer rib, light bulb, and the lens from a pair of sunglasses, and also demonstrates the beginnings of this Venetian plaster process I began developing and working on more. I made it a conscious decision to make a smaller scale of work at this period of time because it seemed to me that having these larger architectural forms and then other forms which were more related to the figure size and the body size, that another level of experience was to be on this intimate scale, something that you envelop rather than it surrounding you. And so this is an image from a piece from my recent show, New York in 2018. I treated the wall in this gallery space in a similar process as I'm doing with the Venetian plaster. It's several layers of paint. This form, this painted wall, for me, relates to the idea of spatial memory and the idea of an expanded physical space. It works kind of both as a background as well as a visual field enveloping the work. You could see a definite surrealist sensibility entering into my work also, I think. This work is made from arm sleeves from a jacket that have been embedded with plaster and then sealed and painted over, incorporated into this larger form, which again is using this Venetian plaster technique. And you can see I'm kind of combining several things from my past vocabulary in a way. I'm working with these lighting gel filters still, smaller discrete objects that are on the wall, and the larger sculptural forms at the same time. So again, something like this is really seeing this whole wall, this whole space, as a completed and unified work in and of itself, although it's comprised of separate objects. And the opposite wall of the space shows the same idea. Of course, I'm using a different color. And here's a detail of that floor work where you could see him using shirt collars to create the form on top of the structure. It works like this, where I'm scaling down and making these more discrete objects. This really, for me, circles back to my original attraction to this anthropological idea of interacting with things and bringing them into the studio. This work involves a plate and a book. And this one, a conch shell and a pair of headphones. This work is a stucco surface that I made on a board with the cast heels of shoes have been applied to the surface of it, and the pink form is actually a shadow stenciled and painted onto the piece. So I just want to close here with another quote by Susan Sontag. And this is from a writing she produced in 2004 about beauty in an essay entitled An Argument Against Beauty. She says, "Beauty, it seems, is immutable, at least when incarnated, fixed in the form of art, because it is in art that beauty is an idea, an internal idea is best embodied. Beauty, should you choose the word that way, is deep, not superficial, hidden, sometimes rather than obvious, consoling, not troubling, indestructible as in art, rather than ephemeral as in nature. Beauty, the stipulatively uplifting kind, perdures." And this uplifting, I would add, applies to the same sense of beauty I opened up with. So, recognizing an independent internal organization within the work in light of its larger human social influence within a world of pluralistic aesthetic images and objects, for me, has the potential to reorient art back to ideal forms and to beauty. Not a stereotypical beauty, but a beauty which engages a humanistic sense regarding art. Even if we accept the idea that human perception and the life of an object are themselves both objects existing on an equal plane, art must be defined as humanistic, since art is not something that inanimate objects are compelled by. It's what humans are. And it is this, it would seem, which defines the true difference between what the mere object is and what the potential for art is. The object, the image, the medium are the vehicle. Yet what is to be considered art is inherent and immanent. For me, knowledge of how art works internally and externally not only leads to an expanded sense of how the artifact or the object functions, but also, by virtue of its internal nature, represents how objects in their pluralistic modes can exist in interdependence with beauty, as does nature through beauty made available through art. Thank you. I'm open for any questions or comments if anybody has. Yes, sir.
I thought it was earlier your work very fascinating how you would just find things around the gallery and kind of do the work there. Is there a difference for you, the process of doing that versus bringing it to your studio and kind of studying it and doing that? Do you have a preference or is there a difference?
I think it's just something that evolves over time with different experiences. I don't have a preference between working one way or the other, but there are tendencies, you know. There's a period of time where I worked more in one direction like that, and it was just, I guess you'd say, a little bit more spontaneous. However, it's a little bit deceiving because when I was doing a lot of those pieces that were involving finding things, I would usually get an inventory from them, you know, what kind of things do you have around? So I kind of had some ideas before I went over there. So it really became about, you know, where is my studio, I guess? You know, like, is it going to be there at that time? Is it on my desktop? Because I'm, you know, using the computer a lot to make decisions actually about when I photograph things and I put them in different placements, and I develop ideas in the studio. So they're kind of all related in a way, I would say. Yes?
How do you know when a piece is finished?
That's a good question. I think I used to have a really difficult time with that one, earlier on in my career. It was, you kind of get to the point where you play a game where you feel like you're just adding things, and you could just keep on going with them, and there's there's really no stopping point. A friend of mine used to joke, when you're done is when it's time to deliver the work to the art gallery, right? But that really bothered me. I never wanted that to happen. I didn't want to be forced to say, okay, I'm done just because of these circumstances. I want to know that I'm done before I actually let go of something. So I got into a habit of just working in a certain way where I would take things, I would build things, I would take them apart, I'd put them back together. So there's really this ebb and flow that would happen until I got to the point where I was like, I want to exhaust all the possibilities before making a decision. And through that, saying, oh yeah, that was too much, that wasn't enough, like, okay, somewhere here in the middle, that's where it's at. So that's usually where I know I'm done. Yes, sir?
Can you share some of your thoughts on how you title paintings?
Yeah, the titles for me, they've kind of evolved too over time. I really had a sense of titling things where I never wanted to identify what the object was. I didn't want names for them, like, oh, that's what this piece is called, or that's what this one is called. It's like I really wanted titles that kind of gave another reference point to bounce off of. So it would be just another sort of concept, like another idea, like titles that give an impression or sort of frame the idea surrounding the work. Some of it's poetic, some of it's kind of humorous, I think, for me at times. It's like titles are kind of like a nice game, I think, to play, but I do spend a lot of time in them, when I'm titling something, it doesn't sound, until I got something that sounds right for a work, and then it just kind of sticks after a certain period of time. And often it's because I think the title sort of just clicks with something in the work, and maybe it's a reference that's in my own imagination, but it's always something I think that points to something else, So you'll see a title in my work, and it's always going to be referring to something else, if you track them down. Yes.
To continue that, I was intrigued by the titles as well, and I was wondering, as they were going by, and I tried to hold them in my head, and I couldn't hold them in my head because, in the same way that your work, I couldn't relay back exactly what something looked like because I don't have a frame of reference for it in the world because it's something new.
Mm-hmm.
It's the reason I thought I couldn't. So with the titles, I kept thinking, they're like the work. Do you think of words as object, image, natural world, synthetic world? Do you think of words the way you think of those elements that make their way into the work and already have a life, and then they come together in your work and become something else?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. There is that whole genre of concrete poetry or something like that. I mean, that kind of seems to get near that idea. I'm not directly influenced by that, but I think I understand that idea in a way that makes sense to me, which is similar to how I think about it. So yeah, I think so. It's funny, one friend of mine who was a writer, he wrote something about my titling as being very, he called it Marxist or something. Especially the early ones, is a very sort of heavy-footed, sort of way of describing things, he said, by not describing them at all, which I always thought was kind of funny. But yeah, I think that the titles were always something particular, I had in mind, and it's just sort of just like composing an image, you know, in a frame, where it's like you are kind of working with things until you're just like, things just kind of work, and you don't really apprehend it at first, but afterwards you do. And then, you know, sometimes I'll even go back and try to retitle them, and it's like, no, it doesn't work. Have to keep it.
Title with surrender in it, does that ring a bell? Do you even know which one?
Yeah, As Volumes Sought Their Surrender. Yeah. That was an important title for me, I think, as well. Some of them, they just kind of roll off like that. And it's like, I know that's what it is. Other titles I struggle with a little bit more.
Just using the word as opposed to volumes.
Mm-hmm.
Surrender as volumes.
Yeah, like I want it to help frame the idea that there's something maybe ongoing, I guess, you know?
It's not static.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, are there any other questions? Anybody? Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you so much.